You lost, old man? This ain't your neighborhood. He's deaf. Look at him. Empty your pockets, Grandpa.
I don't want any trouble, son.
Trouble? You people are the trouble. This is our park. Or what? You gonna cry, old-timer? Yeah, do it!
I'm gonna ask you one time. Walk away. You boys picked the wrong man.
Have you ever watched 6 people surround the one man they should have run from? In the next few minutes, you will find out who that quiet old man in the dark coat really is, why he begged them to walk away, and what happens when a hand that has not made a fist in 40 years finally closes. Comment where you are watching from, drop a like, and let us rewind. His name was Emmett Malone. He was 72 years old. And 40 years before that golden afternoon in the park, he had been the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. Not one of the champions. The champion. He had retired undefeated. 19 fights and 19 wins. 16 of them by knockout. And the boxing men of his day. The old trainers and the hard reporters who had seen everyone still lowered their voices when they said his name. In the ring, they had called him Iron Emmett Malone because of what his right hand did to the men who stood in front of it. And for a decade, there had not been a human being alive who could stay on his feet for 10 rounds against him. There are still men who will corner you at a certain kind of bar and tell you about the night Iron Emmett Malone fought the #1 contender in the pouring rain in front of 80,000 people and dropped him so cleanly in the 3rd round that the man got up smiling. Because getting knocked out by Malone was the closest thing to an honor a fighter of that era could claim. They will tell you he never once taunted a man he beat. They will tell you he helped his fallen opponents up off the canvas every single time and walked them back to their own corner. And that the crowds loved him for it almost as much as they feared the right hand. He fought in an age before the internet, before the endless replays. And so his legend lived mostly in the memories of the men who had seen it. And those men were old now, and scattered across the country. And exactly one of them happened to be feeding pigeons, 30 feet away on the afternoon. 6 young men decided the old man on the bench was nothing at all. But that was 40 years gone. And the world has a short memory. And to the 6 young men circling him in the leaves, Emmett Malone was not a legend. He was just an old black man on a bench that they had decided that afternoon belonged to them. That was the first thing they did not know. Here is the second thing. And it is the one that mattered most. Emmett Malone had not thrown a punch in anger in 40 years. And he had sworn on the thing he loved most in the world that he never would again. The vow had a story behind it. The way the important vows always do. When Emmett was a young champion, rich and famous and full of a fire, he did not yet know how to control. A man had done a cruel and cowardly thing to his wife, and Emmett had found that man. And Emmett had very nearly killed him with the same hands that had made him famous. He had felt something open up inside himself that afternoon. A black door he had not known was there. And he had stood over a broken man in an alley and understood, with a horror that never fully left him, exactly what he was capable of when the fire took him. He had not been a fighter in that alley. He had been a weapon that had gotten loose. It was his wife who pulled him back from that door. Her name was Odessa. She was the only person on earth Emmett Malone had ever been afraid of disappointing. And she had taken his enormous, terrible hands in her small ones that night, and she had said, "Emmett, God did not give you those hands to take the world apart. He gave them to you to hold it up. And you are going to spend the rest of your life learning the difference." And Emmett Malone undisputed champion of the world, had put his face in those legendary hands and wept like a boy. And he had made her a promise that night that he kept for 40 years without breaking it once. He would never again raise his fist in anger. Not for pride, not for money, not for anything. His hands were for lifting only. It was not an easy promise to keep, and Emmett never pretended it was. There is a particular loneliness in being a powerful man who has chosen never to use his power, because the world cannot see the choice, only the stillness. And it reads the stillness as weakness and tests it accordingly. He was shoved by younger men who wanted a story to tell. He was talked down to by people a third his size. He swallowed 1,000 small indignities that a lesser man would have answered with his hands. And every single time he swallowed one, he heard Odessa's voice. And he held the door shut. And then he went home and worked the heavy bag in his basement until his old knuckles split. Because a promise never to hurt anyone is not the same as a promise to stop being what you are. He never stopped training, not once in 40 years. He simply pointed all of it. Every ounce of that terrible gift, at a canvas bag in the dark and a room full of other people's children. He kept it through insults. He kept it through a hard, unfair world that had 100 ways of testing an old black man's patience. He kept it when it would have been so easy and so satisfying to stop keeping it. He hung up the gloves, gave most of his fortune to a youth boxing gym on the poor side of the city so that angry boys could learn what he had learned. And he became, quietly, the gentlest man in his whole congregation. An elder at his church who ushered on Sundays and fixed widows' fences on Saturdays, and never once mentioned that the hands passing the collection plate had once been insured as the most dangerous in the sport. And when Odessa died, 3 years before that afternoon in the park, Emmett Malone did the only thing that kept the grief from swallowing him. He had a simple wooden bench placed on her favorite path, under the maple she loved. And every single day at golden hour, when the light went, the color of her favorite dress, he walked to that bench, and he sat with her. And he talked to her about his day the way he had for 50 years of marriage. It was the most sacred hour of his life. That was the bench Brock Blackwell decided belonged to him. That was the hour 6 young men decided to fill with cruelty. They had cornered a retired, grieving, church-going old man who wanted nothing in this world except to sit quietly with his dead wife in the last good light of the day. They had also cornered a loaded weapon that had spent 40 years keeping itself unloaded by an act of pure will. And they had spent the last 10 minutes doing everything in their power to pull the trigger. Emmett Malone had made his Odessa a promise, and he had kept it for 40 years. And now 6 laughing strangers stood between him and the only thing he had left of her. And every cruel word they spoke was reaching for a door he had spent his whole life holding shut. It had started, the way these things always start, with boredom and cruelty looking for each other. The 6 of them had come into the park loud and restless in the late afternoon. A bottle going around. The kind of young men who have been told their whole lives that consequences are for other people. Brock Blackwell was their center of gravity. 21 years old. Big through the shoulders. The son of a man important enough in that city that Brock had never once had to finish a sentence that began with the words, "Do you know who my father is?" The others arranged themselves around him the way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet. And the loudest of them, a wiry 20-year-old named Devin, made his living inside the group by being willing to do the thing the others only joked about. The youngest, a 19-year-old named Ryder, mostly hung a step behind the rest, laughing when they laughed. Already uneasy that afternoon, in a way he could not have explained. None of them were monsters. Exactly. And that was the worst part. The part that would keep a lot of people up at night after they watched the video. They were ordinary young men who had simply never once been told no by a world that mattered to them. They had grown up certain that the rules bent, that an old man was a prop, that a raised phone turned cruelty into content, that there would never be a bill. Brock, in particular, had been raised on the specific poison of a powerful last name, taught since birth, that consequences were a thing that happened to other families. And he had tested that lesson 100 times, and had it confirmed 100 times. So he had no reason on earth to believe that this bored little cruelty in the leaves would be the one afternoon that finally sent the whole bill due at once. He walked up to Emmett Malone with the total, easy confidence of a man who has never in his life picked the wrong target. Because he never had. Not until now. They saw the old man on the bench, and Brock decided he was entertainment. At first, it was only words. They dropped onto the grass around Odessa's bench and started in on him. The tired old cruelties. Asking if he was lost. Telling him this was their spot. Asking how a man dressed like that could afford to sit down in a neighborhood like this. Emmett Malone did what he had trained himself to do for 40 years. He absorbed it. "Shh," he said, quietly. That he did not want any trouble, that he came here every day to sit with his wife. And he nodded toward the small brass plate on the back of the bench with Odessa's name on it. That was a mistake. Because cruelty smells softness, the way a shark smells blood. And the mention of his dead wife was a soft place. And Devin went straight for it. He read the name off the plate in a mocking sing-song and asked if the old man talked to benches often. And asked if his wife had left him because he was too ugly or just too poor. And the group laughed. And something in Emmett Malone's chest went very still and very quiet. He stood up from the bench. He said, again, more firmly this time, that he was going to go, and that they should go too, and live good lives. They did not let him go. That was the moment it stopped being ugly words and became something else. Brock stepped into his path and put a flat hand on the old man's chest and shoved him back down toward the bench. And the others closed the circle. And the phones came up, and the racial thing that had been humming under every word finally said itself out loud. You people, this is our park. Go back where you belong. They flicked his hat off into the leaves. They knocked the sunglasses off his face. They circled a 72-year-old man in the last good light of the day and made him small for the crime of sitting on a bench with his dead wife's name on it. Across the path, a young woman named Simone, a nursing student who had been jogging her usual loop, slowed to a stop, and her stomach turned over. And she did the only thing she could think to do that would not get an old man killed faster. She lifted her phone, and she started to record, and her hands were shaking. On a bench 30 feet away, an old man in a flat cap who had been feeding pigeons squinted at the circle, and at the face of the man, in the middle of it. And something ancient and disbelieving began to move across his features. Emmett Malone stood inside the ring of them with his hands open at his sides and his heart breaking. Not for himself, but because he could feel the old fire waking up in the deep of him, the fire he had promised Odessa he would never feed again. And he was using every ounce of 40 years of discipline to keep the door shut. He looked at these young men, and he did not see enemies. He saw boys who had never been taught the one thing that would have saved them, which was that the world is full of quiet people carrying things you cannot see, and that you must never, ever assume the man you have decided is nothing, is actually nothing. He gave them every chance. People would count them up later, on the tape, and the count became part of the legend. 3 separate times, in 3 separate ways. Emmett Malone offered those young men a clean way out. And he did it not because he was afraid of them, but because he was afraid of himself, of what waited behind his own 40 years of restraint. And because somewhere in his grieving heart, he already knew exactly how badly this was going to end for them. And he did not want it to. That is the thing the whole country would slowly come to understand about the old man on the bench. When he begged them to stop, he was not pleading for mercy. He was offering it. "Please," Emmett said. And it was not a beg. It was a warning, wearing the clothes of a prayer. "I am asking you as nicely as a man can ask. Let me pick up my hat, and let me go home. You do not want what happens if this keeps going. I promise you that you do not." Brock Blackwell laughed in his face. And then Brock Blackwell did the thing that ended his entire life as he had known it. He reached into his jacket, and he pulled out a knife, and he flicked it open in the golden light, and he pressed the flat of it against the old man's cheek, and he said, still grinning, still playing to the phones, "Beg better, old man." And in that instant, with a blade against his face and 6 young men laughing and his dead wife's name on the bench behind him, Emmett Malone felt the door he had held shut for 40 years come off its hinges. And he closed his eyes. And he said, so softly that only Brock heard it, "I am so sorry. Odessa." What happened next took about 11 seconds. And Simone's shaking phone caught every one of them. And half the world would eventually watch it. And not one person who saw it ever forgot it. The knife came first. Because the knife was the thing that could kill him. And 40 years of stillness did not make Emmett Malone slow. It made him patient. His left hand, the hand Odessa used to hold, came up faster than anyone in that circle could follow. And it closed around Brock Blackwell's wrist. And it turned. And the blade dropped into the leaves like a dead thing. And then the right hand moved. You have to understand what that hand had been. For 10 years, it had been the most feared object in an entire sport. A thing grown men had nightmares about. And even at 72. Even after 40 years of gardening and hymnals and gentleness, the body does not forget the deepest thing it ever knew how to do. The right hand came up in a short, economical arc. No wind up, no anger, you could see. Just 40 years of buried mastery arriving all at once. And it landed one time on the hinge of Brock Blackwell's jaw. And Brock folded straight down into the leaves, unconscious, before his knees knew it. Out as cold and complete as a blown candle. The crowd made a single sound. A collective intake of breath. The sound people make when they witness something they do not have a category for. Because it did not look like a fight. A fight is 2 people. This was not 2 people. This was a force of nature that had agreed, 40 years ago, to behave like a gentle old man, briefly and precisely remembering that it was a force of nature. There was no rage in it that anyone could point to. His face never changed. That was the part that frightened them most. Later, watching it back 100 times. The most dangerous 11 seconds any of them had ever seen were performed by a man whose expression stayed as calm and as sorrowful as a preacher standing at a graveside. And here is the thing that made it holy instead of horrible. Emmett Malone pulled it. A man with that hand, in that much danger, with a knife just off his cheek, would have been within every right God and the law allowed to end Brock Blackwell, permanently. Emmett had felt exactly how much force to use to do that. The way you feel the weight of a thing you have carried your whole life, and in the half-second the punch traveled. The 72-year-old grieving deacon made a decision that told you everything about who he actually was. He kept the promise even while he broke it. He hit the boy with maybe a tenth of what he had. A controlled, surgical, measured blow. Enough to switch him off, and not 1 ounce more. And Odessa's voice was in that restraint. Hold it up. Do not take it apart. Even now, even here. The others came apart in every direction. Devin, screaming, swung a wild haymaker at the old man's head. And Emmett Malone was simply not where the punch went. His head sliding 2 inches to the side with an economy that 40 years could not rust. And he answered it with a single short shot to the body that folded Devin over, gasping into the grass. Done. No more fighting him. Just trying to remember how to breathe. 2 of the others rushed him together, and the old champion moved between them like water. A small step, a turn, 1 clean, measured counter each. And one of them sat down hard, clutching his ribs, and the other simply sat down, blinking, not entirely sure how the ground had gotten to him. And then it was quiet. 11 seconds. 5 young men on the ground, and not one of them badly hurt, because the man who put them there had chosen, in the middle of breaking the most sacred promise of his life, to pull every single punch. There would not be a broken bone among them. That was the part the doctors could not get over later. 6 healthy young attackers, a former heavyweight champion, a knife, and the worst injury in the whole thing was a chipped tooth. Boxing people who watched the video later broke it down frame by frame, the way they break down championship fights. And what they saw made them go quiet. Every movement was economical. Every strike landed on the one spot that ends a man without harming him. The button on the jaw. The liver. The places a master spends a lifetime learning so that he never has to hit a man twice. There was no wasted motion in it anywhere. No wild swing. No loss of control. A younger champion. A hungrier one. Might have done real damage and called it self-defense and been within his rights. It took a man of 72. A man who had spent 40 years learning exactly how much of himself to withhold. To disarm a blade and drop 6 attackers and leave every one of them able to walk to the ambulance under his own power. A lesser man. A smaller man. Would have left that park a crime scene. Emmett Malone left it a lesson. The 6th one, the youngest, the 19-year-old named Ryder, had not moved at all. He stood frozen at the edge of the leaves with his hands half raised and tears on his face and a wet stain spreading down the front of his jeans. And he was not looking at his fallen friends. He was looking at the old man, and he was making a sound. A small, broken, repeating sound. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Emmett Malone looked back at the terrified boy. And he did not raise a hand toward him. He lowered them both, slowly, and the fire went back down behind his eyes. And he became again, in front of everyone, the gentle old man who had only wanted to sit with his wife. He bent down, with the stiffness of his years, and he picked his hat up out of the leaves, and he put it back on. And that was the moment the old man in the flat cap finally reached the edge of the circle, shaking, tears streaming down his weathered face, and pointed one trembling finger at the man in the dark coat and said the words that turned a viral video into a legend. Sweet Lord in heaven, do you know who that is? That is Iron Emmett Malone. That is the heavyweight champion of the world. The name moved through the gathering crowd like a current through water. By now, 12 people had drifted over. Then 24, drawn by the noise and the young men on the ground and the impossible calm of the old man in the dark coat, and the fellow in the flat cap, whose name was Saul, and who had watched Emmett Malone fight on a black and white television as a boy, could not stop talking, the words tumbling out of him half in tears. He told them. He told the whole crowd who they were looking at. 19-0, undefeated. The champion who retired on top when no one could touch him, who gave his belts and most of his money to a gym for poor kids, who nobody had seen in decades because he had walked away from all of it to live a quiet life with a woman named Odessa. 40 years ago, this old man had been the most dangerous human being on the planet, and 6 boys had just put a knife to his face over a park bench. For a moment, nobody in the crowd spoke, because the arithmetic was too big to say out loud. This man could have killed all 6 of them. Every honest person standing there understood it in their bones. He could have killed them with the knife, or without it, in less time than it takes to describe. And he would have been, by any law and any god, entirely justified in doing it. Instead, he had switched them off like lamps and stopped. The mercy was almost harder to look at than violence would have been, because violence at least makes a kind of sense. And this did not. This was a man being gentle with the people who had just tried to end him. In the last gold light of the day, on the bench where his dead wife's name was screwed into the wood, the crowd looked at the 5 young men groaning in the leaves, and then at the 72-year-old man calmly brushing dirt off his hat. And they understood, all at once, the size of the mercy they had just witnessed. He had not beaten those boys. He had corrected them with a precision that could only be called kindness. And then he had stopped. Simone stood at the edge of it, with her phone still running and tears on her face. And she would tell reporters later that the thing she could not get over was not the speed or the power. It was that after 11 seconds of 40-year-old lightning, the old man had picked up his hat and looked like he wanted to cry. Because Emmett Malone was not triumphant, Emmett Malone was grieving. He walked through the parting crowd, back to Odessa's bench, and he sat down heavily on it, and he put his big scarred hands over his face, and his shoulders shook. He had kept a promise for 40 years, and he had just broken it in 11 seconds. And it did not matter to his heart that anyone with eyes could see he had had no choice. He sat on his dead wife's bench, and he wept. And he whispered that he was sorry, over and over, to a woman only he could hear. And the crowd that had been buzzing went quiet and respectful around him, because even strangers could feel that they were watching something sacred and sad. That was how the police found the scene when the first cruiser pulled up. And for a few dangerous minutes, it looked like the story might go the ugly, familiar way after all. Because what a responding officer sees, at first glance, is 6 injured young white men on the ground and 1 old black man at the center of it. And there is a version of this country where that is the entire story, where the cuffs go on the wrong wrists and the truth never catches up. The first officer, a younger man, actually had his hand on his cuffs and his voice raised at Emmett before his partner. An older sergeant named Renner held up a hand and said, "Wait." Renner had already clocked the knife in the leaves. He had already seen the 40 phones. And when a dozen witnesses and a nursing student with a video all started talking at once, telling the same story. The story of 6 armed young men cornering a grieving old man who begged them 3 times to walk away. Sergeant Renner made the decision that a lot of men in his position would not have, which was to slow down and look and get it right. It should not be a remarkable thing. A police officer choosing to find the truth instead of the easy story. And the fact that it felt remarkable told you something sad about how often it goes the other way. But Sergeant Renner did it. He collected the knife into an evidence bag with his own gloved hands. He took Simone's name and a copy of her video before anyone could suggest it disappear. He kept the younger officer's hands well off Emmett Malone, and when he finally walked over to the old man weeping on the bench, he did not do it with cuffs out. He did it with his hat in his hand. And he crouched down to the champion's level. And he said, quietly, "Take all the time you need, sir." And he let the man grieve. It was right about then that Warren Blackwell arrived. And the second half of the fight began. This one had no punches in it. And it was uglier than the first. Warren Blackwell was Brock's father, and he was a city councilman. And he had spent 20 years learning that money and position could rewrite almost any afternoon. Someone had called him the second the cruisers showed. And he came across that park like a storm front. And he did not kneel by his unconscious son. And he did not ask what had happened. He went straight for the sergeant. And he started giving orders. He wanted that man arrested. He pointed at Emmett Malone, weeping on a bench. And he called him a violent animal who had attacked a group of boys. And he said names. And he made threats. And he demanded that the video be confiscated. And he told Sergeant Renner exactly how short the rest of his career would be if he did not put cuffs on the old man right now. Emmett Malone looked up from his grief at the shouting man. And he did not say a word in his own defense. He had spent 40 years learning that the truth does not need you to yell for it. He simply looked at Warren Blackwell. And then at the boy stirring on the ground. And something like pity crossed the old champion's face. Because he understood, better than anyone in that park, exactly where a boy like Brock learns to put a knife to a stranger's cheek and laugh. Warren Blackwell had built a 20-year career on the certainty that the right last name could bury any inconvenient truth. And he was, at that very moment, on live video in front of 200 phones, threatening a police officer into framing a beloved 72-year-old champion for the crime of surviving 6 armed attackers. And he had absolutely no idea that the clip was already climbing toward the first of what would soon be 90 million views. By the next morning, the whole country had watched it. And the country was not confused about what it had seen. Simone's video was the one that went the widest. Because Simone's video had sound. And sound was the thing that hanged them. You could hear it all. You could hear Emmett Malone ask them, gently, to let him go. You could hear him warn them, a second time, and a third. You could hear a young man read a dead woman's name off a bench in a mocking little song. You could hear the word people said, the way a slur is said. You could hear the click of a knife. And then you could watch 11 seconds of the most controlled violence any of them had ever seen. An old man dismantle 6 armed attackers and choose, visibly, mercifully, not to seriously hurt a single one of them. There was no version of that video that made Emmett Malone the villain. There was no clever edit. No spin. No last name on earth that could survive the sound of a 72-year-old man saying please 3 times before a knife touched his face. The country did something it does not often do anymore. It agreed. For one strange, unified week. People who agreed on nothing at all agreed on this. They had watched a good man cornered by cruelty, and they had watched that cruelty finally, at long last, meet a wall it could not move, and they had watched the wall be merciful, and the mercy had made the whole thing feel almost holy. Old fight footage of Iron Emmett Malone resurfaced and was watched millions of times by people who had not been alive when he retired. His Youth Gym's donation page, which had scraped by on almost nothing for a decade, raised a full year of its budget in a single afternoon, and then simply kept going. Reporters found the small brass plate on the back of the bench and printed Odessa's name in the papers. And strangers began leaving flowers on it. And an old man who had spent 3 lonely years grieving his wife in obscurity woke up to discover that a whole nation had decided, overnight, to grieve her alongside him. Warren Blackwell found that out the hard way, because there was a second video. And the second video destroyed him even more completely than the first destroyed his son. Somebody had filmed the councilman too. Somebody had caught every second of Warren Blackwell storming into that park, stepping over his own unconscious child without a glance, and threatening a police sergeant into arresting a beloved champion for the crime of defending his own life. The country watched a powerful man try, in real time, on camera, to make the truth disappear by sheer force of privilege. And the country's stomach turned. By the end of the week, the phrase, "Do you know who my father is?" had become a national punchline with Brock Blackwell's face attached to it. And Warren Blackwell's 20-year career came down like a wall that had been leaning for a long time. The threatened officer testified about the threat. Old deals got a new and unfriendly look. The party that had once been grooming him for higher office could not get far enough away from him fast enough. And by the time the leaves were gone from the trees, Warren Blackwell was finished. Not because a champion took revenge on him, but because he had reached, one time too many, for a lever that the whole world happened to be watching him pull. The 6 young men were charged. And the charges were not small. Assault with a deadly weapon. Because of the words on the tape, the words about where an old black man did and did not belong. The charges carried the enhancement that the law reserves for cruelty aimed at a man for what he is. And every commentator in the country agreed that the enhancement had never in its history been more plainly earned. There was no trial in the ordinary sense, because there was nothing left to argue. You cannot cross-examine 11 seconds of sound and video watched 90 million times. The expensive lawyers the Blackwell money had bought took one long look at the tape and started quietly talking about pleas instead of defenses. Un by un. The young men who had laughed in a circle in the leaves stood up in silent courtrooms and heard the cost of the afternoon read out loud. And the cost was years. Real years. Carved out of the lives they had been so sure would never once send them a bill. Brock Blackwell, who had put a knife to a stranger's face because he was bored and certain and untouchable, learned across that long year that untouchable had only ever been a bedtime story his father's money told him, and that the story was finally, permanently over. Brock Blackwell, who woke up in a hospital bed a national villain, learned across the following year that the one thing his father's name could no longer buy him was a way out. He went away. So did most of the others. But not all of them. And here the story turns. The way Emmett Malone's whole life had turned on the mercy of people who chose to see him. The youngest one, Ryder. The 19-year-old who had frozen in the leaves and wet himself and said sorry until the word stopped, meaning anything. Did the one thing none of the others had the courage to do. He walked into a police station the very next day, before any deal was on the table, and he told the entire truth. About that afternoon and about others, about who brought the knives and who picked the targets and how long it had been going on. He did not do it to save himself. He did it because he had looked into the face of a man he had helped corner and seen there, instead of the monster he expected. A grief so deep and a mercy so total that it had broken something loose in him that needed breaking. He testified. He named it all. And when the prosecutors, grateful, asked the one witness whose opinion the whole country would have honored, when they asked Emmett Malone himself what should be done with the boy named Ryder, the old champion said something that made a hard prosecutor put down her pen. That one looked at me, Emmett said, and he was ashamed. Shame means there is still something in there worth saving. Do not throw that boy away. I have spent my whole life watching this country throw away boys who still had something worth saving. Not this one. Give him to me." And so, while a councilman's empire turned to ash, and his son sat in a cell built by his own laughter, an old man who had asked only to sit with his dead wife made a phone call, and quietly began to turn the worst afternoon of his life into the last and most important work of it. The gym on the poor side of the city had been getting by on almost nothing for years. The gym Emmett Malone had quietly funded with his championship money so that angry boys would have somewhere to put the fire instead of into each other. After that video, the whole country found it. The donations came in from everywhere. From old fight fans and young people who had never heard his name until that week, and everyone in between. And for the first time in its long, struggling life, the gym had more than it needed. Emmett could have kept the attention on himself. He could have done the talk shows, sold the book, taken the money. He did none of it. He pointed every camera and every dollar at the gym and at the kids in it. And he said the same thing every single time. That a strong man is not a man who can hurt people. That any fool can hurt people. That a strong man is one who has the power to hurt and chooses, every single day, to hold it up instead. He said it to reporters, and he said it to donors, but mostly he said it to the kids. The 9 and 10-year-olds who crowded into the old gym, now in numbers the building could barely hold, drawn in by a video and staying for the man. He would gather them at the end of a session, these children with their taped-up hands, and he would hold his own enormous scarred fists up in front of them, the most dangerous hands the sport had ever produced. And he would tell them that the entire purpose of learning to fight was so that you would never have to, so that you would carry nothing to prove and no fear to answer, so that you could afford to be the gentlest person in every single room precisely because you were the most capable of not being. Strength, he told them, is a promise you make to everyone smaller than you. That is the only honest reason there has ever been to build it. Hold it up. Odessa's words, 40 years later, out of the mouth of a champion, into the ears of a country that needed to hear them. And the boy named Ryder became the first proof that the old man meant it. Emmett took Ryder into the gym. Not as a fighter. Not at first. But as a kid who swept floors and racked weights and learned slowly, painfully, under the eye of the gentlest hard man he had ever met, that he was not the worst thing he had ever done. Ryder finished his community service there, and then he just kept coming. Because for the first time in his life, someone had refused to give up on him. And that refusal did to Ryder exactly what a patient woman named Odessa had once done, a lifetime ago. For a young man with a black door inside him, it saved him. 2 years later, Ryder was helping run the beginners program, teaching 9 and 10-year-olds the sport. And the first thing he told every single new kid before they ever made a fist was the thing the old champion had taught him. These hands are for lifting. You will learn the difference here, or you will not learn it from me. Emmett Malone made his peace with the promise he had broken. He came to believe, and his pastor helped him believe it, that Odessa had not asked him to be helpless. She had asked him to be in control of the terrible gift God gave him. And on the worst afternoon of his life, with a knife at his cheek and boys who could not be reasoned with, he had been in control of it completely. So completely that 6 attackers walked away with a chipped tooth between them. He had not opened the black door. He had opened it exactly 2 inches, used precisely what was needed, and closed it again. And that, his pastor told him, was not the breaking of the promise. That was the promise, kept under the hardest test a man ever gets. He needed to hear that, because the guilt had been real. And it had been heavy. And for a while after that afternoon, Emmett Malone had not been certain he could live with what his hands had done. Even in mercy. Even with no other choice on earth available to him. It was Ryder, in the end, who quietly gave the old man his own peace back, without ever once knowing that he had done it. Because every day that the boy showed up at the gym and got a little better and a little gentler and a little more like a man worth being, Emmett Malone had his proof in front of him. The afternoon in the park had not only ended in violence, it had also, somehow, in the strange and generous arithmetic of grace, produced one saved life out of 6 ruined ones. And the saved one was the boy who had been ashamed. A lesser man would have spent his nights counting the 6. Emmett Malone chose, every single morning, to count the 1. He still went to the bench every day at golden hour. He still told Odessa about his day. Only now his days were full again. Full of kids and mitts and the sound of a gym that no longer worried about the rent. And he would sit under her maple in the last good light and tell her about a boy named Ryder who was going to be all right. And about the little ones learning to jab. And about how her words had gone out across the whole country 40 years after she first said them to a weeping young man in the dark. Hold it up. He had. Odessa. He finally understood what you meant. And he had. And that is the whole story. And here is the only thing it was ever really about. The 6 young men in that park made the oldest mistake there is. They looked at a quiet old man and decided that quiet meant weak. That old meant harmless. That a person who does not show you his power must not have any. They are not the only ones who make that mistake. We make it every day. In lobbies and on sidewalks and on park benches. About the tired and the elderly and the overlooked and the unshowy. The world is absolutely full of people carrying quiet strength you cannot see. Strength earned in rings and wars and hospitals and decades you know nothing about. And the wise learn to treat every single person as if they might be a champion in a dark coat. Because the humbling truth is that any one of them might be. So here is my question for you tonight. And I read every comment. Who is the quiet, unshowy person in your life whose strength you almost missed? Tell me about them below. And tell me where you are watching from. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that gentleness is not weakness. It is strength that has learned what it is for. And subscribe, because we tell the stories of the underestimated here. The quiet ones, the world walks right past. Right up until the moment they stand up. I am not emotionally okay after this one. The man begged them 3 times to walk away. 3. And then he dismantled 6 armed guys in 11 seconds and still pulled every punch so hard the worst injury was a chipped tooth because a promise to his dead wife mattered more to him than his own safety. That is not weakness. That is the most powerful thing I have ever watched. And then he adopts the one kid who actually felt bad about it? Sir, the way strength is supposed to work is right there. Be gentle, protect the quiet ones, and never, ever decide the old man on the bench is nobody. Drop a like if Iron Malone earned your whole entire respect.